Goed, als klein jongen in de stad woonden wij met mijn ouders. Had mijn vader, B.O. Jackson, het regelmatig over de prizes. Dat was voor mij in ieder geval niks anders dan een verhaal, omdat ik die mensen niet kende. En volgens mij was het 3 jaar geleden dat ik ze voor het eerst lijfelijk mocht ontmoeten. En vandaag zijn ze hier om een inleiding te verzorgen. Dat doet me goed. Ik ben vereerd dat ik ze heb mogen leren kennen. Zowel Sally als Richard. En Richard is antropoloog. Idem dito, Sally is ook antropoloog en kunstcritica. In de jaren 60 en 70 deden ze samen jarenlang onderzoek in een aantal Saamaka-dorpen. Samen, soms apart. Ze hebben heel veel boeken geschreven. Alex refereerde al daarnaar. Over met name de Saamaka. Ze hebben ook vele prijzen gewonnen van de boeken die ze uitgebracht hebben. Wat ik interessant vind ook aan Richard en Sally, en dat is, ze spreken trouwens vloeiend Saamakaans, omdat ze jaren in een gebieden hebben gewoond. Ze hebben zelf een boek in het Saamakaans uitgebracht. En ik ben blij met zijn aanwezigheid hier, om ons ook de formatie van de Saamaka met ons te delen vanuit een perspectief zoals hij dat kan. En ik ben blij en mag aankondigen, Richard, ik word... Er staat een korte pauze na alleen. Dat was even een onderontje met de hoofdkapitein. Ik ben blij met hun aanwezigheid. Beiden staan hier. Ik wil graag een hartelijk applaus voor Sally en Richard Prizes. Richard, ja. Dat zal in het Engels geschieden. En nogmaals, datgene wat er vandaag verteld wordt, wordt straks ook gedocumenteerd. Dus u kunt het straks ook teruglezen op de site van de stichting. En er zijn tevens daarna USB-sticks te verkrijgen. Richard Prizes over de formatie van de Saamaka.
So, den sembe ondeno. So, mi ofandi ingi strongo, bika mata fandi Holland strongo. Okay? In his Nobel Prize lecture, which was called The Antilles, Fragments of Epic Memory, Derek Walcott spoke of what the captive Africans brought to the New World. He said, deprived of their original language, the captured tribes create their own, accreting and secreting fragments of an old and epic vocabulary, an ancestral ecstatic rhythm in the blood that cannot be subdued by slavery. The original language dissolves from the exhaustion of distance like fog trying to cross an ocean. The stripped man is driven back to that self-astonishing elemental force, his mind. That is the basis of the Antillean experience. This shipwreck of fragments, these echoes, these shards of a huge tribal vocabulary, these partially remembered customs, and they are not destroyed, they're not decayed, but strong. They survive the Middle Passage. And one day, in 2005, my Saamaka friend Toy in Cayenne gave me his own version. Toy said to me, when the old ones came out from Africa, they couldn't bring their obia pots, they couldn't bring their stools, but they knew how to summon their gods and to have them make new ones on this side. They no longer had the original pots or stools, but they carried the knowledge in their hearts. So, first, where did the Africans who became Saamakas come from? Alex gave some hints about all the Marrons, but for the formative period of Saamaka society, whose outer limits we can place between 1675 and 1725, about 50 years, and whose heart we can place between 1690 and 1715, the transatlantic slave trade database tells us that there were 3 broad regions of Africa where the ancestors of the Saamakas lived. The Bight of Benin, people whom the Dutch called Papa; Luango, people who the Dutch called Luangos or Congos; and in a far smaller proportion, the Gold Coast, Ghana today, so-called Coromantes. More of them went to Juca because the trade shifted to the west. Fewer of them came to Saamaka. These captive people spoke a large number of languages. They came from scores of different states and polities that were in many cases at war one with the other during this period. Yet despite their considerable internal cultural and political diversity, the peoples of each of the 3 regions shared more with one another than they did with the other 2, because of linguistic abilities, trade, conquest, and other kinds of intercourse over the centuries. Once landed in the colony of Suriname, each shipload of captive Africans was further dispersed by the planters, who chose their purchases with the specific intent to separate people who may have known each other or who spoke the same language in order to prevent rebellion. Combined with a firm policy not to separate slave families when plantations were sold, unlike the United States, say, the slaves in Suriname were considered to belong to the soil. The primary identity of enslaved Africans rapidly shifted from their African origins to their plantation community, where they now had family and comrades, and where they'd already begun to bury their dead, which, as you know, is very important. On the plantations, as among Saamakas today, the term for best friend was mati, which derived from shipmate. And the Africans who lived together on a plantation soon began calling one another sibi, which originated as a term of address for those who had shared passage on the same slave sipi ship. They called each other sibi, as people still do today in Saamaka. Here is that famous picture that Alex showed from 1707, Dirk Valkenburg in the Dombi plantation, Palmaneribo. Within the earliest decades of the African presence in Suriname, the enslaved Africans had developed a new Creole language, Sonantongo, and on the largely Jewish plantations along the Suriname River, they developed a closely related language called Jew-Tongo, which had much more Portuguese in it. They had developed the core of a new religion and much else. The striking non-Europeanness of this early cultural synthesis, when you compare it with what happened in other parts of the Americas, that can be explained in part by the unusually high ratio of Africans to Europeans in Suriname. More than 25 Africans for every European for most of the 18th century. And in the plantation districts, there were 65 Africans for every European, which meant that it was, as Alex was suggesting, the Africans who did creolization largely among themselves. So the central motor for that might be termed inter-African syncretism. Suriname creolization was built on a diversity of African heritages, with far smaller inputs than elsewhere from European and Amerindian sources. What Walcott called this shipwreck of fragments, these echoes, these shards of a huge tribal vocabulary, these partially remembered customs became, for those Africans on early Suriname plantations, the building blocks of a new civilization. And when the ancestors of the Saamakas escaped into the forest during the late 17th and very early 18th centuries, they carried with them the seeds of a powerful new cultural system. The great bulk of the people who became known as Saamakas once they escaped between 1690 and 1712, just in a very short period. With very rare exceptions, they had been born in Africa. Almost all the people who escaped had been born in Africa. Most were men. Most were very young, still in their teens or 20s. Most had spent little time in slavery, more often months than years. By the time of their escapes, most of them spoke Ju-Tongo, which they then very quickly developed into their own distinctive language, Saamaka Tongo. As they faced the challenge of building institutions, political institutions, family, religious institutions, while waging war and trying to survive in an unfamiliar and hostile environment, they drew on the immense riches of their African pasts. Leadership drew authority not only from personal charisma and knowledge, but also from divination, which encouraged the communal negotiation of developing institutions. The runaways, fighting for their individual and collective survival, had strong incentives for very rapid nation building, to build a Saamaka nation, and they did. Among the initial African-born Saamakas, some of those who shared a broad regional origin, like the Komantis or Papa or Luangos, were undoubtedly the core who invented each tradition of playing particular drums and conducting particular rites together. I mean, how could it have been otherwise? They came from the same places. By the time their sons' and daughters' generations had taken over, these African identities had faded in salience, replaced by powerful new clan and village identities. So the second generation of men had learned from their fathers, from their mother's brothers, and from other elders. The cults of Papa, Komanti, and Luango had already been effectively separated from their shared African region inventors to become part of a whole new system. It didn't matter where your grandmother or grandfather had come from, you were now Saamaka. And that new system included not just Papa and Komanti and Luango, but also Apuku and Papagaru and Watawenu, the cult of the ancestors, and much more. As they confronted their new environment, these early Saamakas learned about local gods through a process of trial and error, drawing on a tightly interwoven complex of pan-African ideas and practices regarding illness, divination, and causality. A misfortune, an illness, or some other affliction, automatically signaled the need for divination, which in turn revealed a cause. Why did the tree fall on a house? Often that cause turned out to be a local deity that they hadn't known about before because they'd never lived in that environment. And that deity, that god, lived in a particular rock or tree. The idea that local deities could cause illness when they were offended. For example, if you cut a field too close to a certain tree, that idea was widespread in West and Central Africa. But the classification of local deities, as well as the identities of individual deities in Africa, varied a great deal from one society to another. And what these early Saamakas did was they did divination together with people from a diversity of African origins asking questions together through a spirit medium who was possessed or through some other kind of divination. They asked questions of a god or ancestor in order to grasp the nature of the kinds of gods that now surrounded them. And the detailed pictures that emerged of the personality, the family connections, the abode, the whims and foibles of each local deity permitted the codification by this new community of new religious institutions, classes of gods such as Vodou, boa constrictor deities, and their cousins, Watawenu, who live in anacondas, or Apuku, forest spirits, each with a complex and distinctive cult, including shrines, drums, dance, songs, plays, languages, and priests and priestesses. Indeed, this kind of public divination, which was an arena for the communal creation of new cultural forms, worked as effectively as it did, in part because of the widespread African preference for additivity over exclusivity in most religious contexts. You could always add new things to your religious beliefs. Linguistic and ritual evidence suggests that it was people born in the Bight of Benin, in those cultures where snake gods were central, who took the lead in developing the Saamaka Papagadu, Vodou complex. But that same evidence shows that there was significant participation also by Central Africans in that early syncretic process. Similarly, people from the Gold Coast seem to have taken the lead in developing various warrior rites, Komanti. But again, Central African contributions are part of Komanti also. And as people who are called Papa constituted nearly 50% of the initial Saamaka population, it makes sense that some of them would have drummed and sung together, and that within the developing ritual system, the Papa complex that they created would be passed on and learned by other men who felt an affinity with it and helped that cult become central to all Saamaka funerals. The identity of almost all the bands of runaways who fought their way southward in the early years was already based on a common plantation origin, as Alex suggested. So what became the great matrilineal clans that form the major social units of the society, the Lo, are in great majority named for the plantations that their ancestors came from. Machao came from Emmanuel Machao, Nasi, owned by the Nasi family, Dombis, Domine Basiliers, and Biitu came from the Brito family, Paputu came from the widow Papot's plantation, Kasitu clan was owned by Joseph Castillo, Kasitu, Abaisa from the Labadisa religious order, Watambi, from Watermolen, and so on. The only exception in Saamaka is the Langu clan, part of which came from a single shipload of Africans who arrived during an international war and quickly escaped together along with some Amerindian women who they abducted. So the great bulk of initial Saamakas seem, from the time they escaped and began to have a common consciousness of we are the same people, they conceptualized them in terms of new communities, their Lo, rather than in terms of some sort of African ethnicity. Saamaka accounts of their origin, of their twin rituals, tweeling, provides one example of how Saamakas envision the process of discovery that marked their very early years, their formation in the forest. Here, the metaphor isn't divination, but a different kind of divine intervention. But it represents a precise Saamaka way of speaking about the process of legitimizing a newly created institution that took place 3 centuries ago, more. So here's a story as told me by Pleiki in 1978. he was a twin. He was a tweeling. So he knew about this. And the people who own this obi are from Makisiamau, which I think is head Kapiteni Mutu's people. In any case, Pleiki said Ma Zoe was an early Watambi runaway. Watambi is a clan. Once in the forest, she gave birth to twins. She went to her garden one day and she left the twins, the babies, in a nearby gangasa, in a shed. But when she came back for them, she saw that there was a large monkey sitting right next to them. So she hid because she was afraid. She was very afraid, so she watched. She saw that the monkey had put together a large pile of leaves, and it was breaking them up, and mashing them. And the monkey put them into a pot that was there and put it on the fire. And when the leaves had boiled, the monkey removed them and poured the liquid into a calabash. And with that, it washed one of the children, just the way a mother washes a child. And then it took the water off the child, shook it and put it down, and did the same thing to the other child. And finally, it gave a calabash of the leaf water to each child to drink. The woman was watching all of this, the mother. And then when the monkey was finished, the monkey left. And the mother ran to the twins. It didn't take the twins with it. But she looked at the leaves very carefully. Which ones she'd given them the monkey had given them to drink, which leaves had been used for washing. And those are the very leaves that remain for us today for the great Watambi twin obia. So Saamaka say they learned this obia, which is used on all twins in Saamaka, from a monkey. And when you have twins in Saamaka, the parents, the brothers and sisters are all involved in complex rituals that draw on ideas and practices from a variety of West African societies. For instance, in a lot of societies in West Africa, twins are associated with monkeys. So there are ideas like that. But this is something very specific that Saamaka's discovered in the forest. It was another example of this kind of inter-African creolization. So, during the first century of existence, Saamakas were not only creating a new civilization, a new religion, a new language, a new system of justice, a new political system, they were also fighting a war against very determined Dutch planters and their armies of soldiers and slaves. I'm not going to talk about slavery and the wars today, except to remind you briefly of the brutalities and tortures that the Dutch inflicted on captured Saamakas. When these armies captured a Saamaka, and I'll just give you one example from 1730, when there was a military expedition against the Saamakas that brought back a number of captives to Paramaribo. And the Hof van Politie, the Court of Justice, gave the following sentences. This is an iconic picture from Stedman of the same punishment. And excuse my Dutch, but the court said, te weet de neger Josie om met een ijzeren haak door zijn ribben geslagen aan de galg te werden opgehangen en aldaar te blijven tot daar de dood na volgt. Gestorven zijnde de kop te werden afgekapt en alhier op een staak aan de waterkant te werden gesteld en de romp ten prooi der volgeren te blijven. En de negro's Virai en Manbote om aan een paal te werden gebonden en dezelfde met kleine vuur levendig tot affiche weer brandende intussentijd met glooiende tangen genepen. De negerinnen Lucretia, Ambira, Aga, Gomba, Marie en Victoria op een kruis te werden gelicht allereerst allen levendig geradbraakt en na gedaan executies de koppen afgehakt op staken alhier aan de waterkant van Paramaribo, aan de waterkant gesteld. De negerinnen Diana en Christina om de koppen met een beel te worden afgeslagen en alhier mede aan de waterkant op palen te werden gesteld. These were Saamakas, the ancestors of many people here. Saamakas tell many stories about their century-long fight for freedom. And I have tried to record what they have taught me in 3 books. First Time, Alabi's World, Travels with Troy, and then at the request of Ugo Yabini and the Saamaka people, we translated First Time into the Saamaka language. It's now available. You can get it on Amazon. So this is what Saamaka told me in the 1960s and 70s in their own language, in this book, Felicite. And the VSK, the organization of Saamaka captains, bought 3,000 copies of Felicite and distributed it to schools and in all the villages of Saamaka. And the narratives of Saamaka historians are at once heroic and moving and inspirational. Some tell of raids on plantations when Saamakas went back to take things, liberating women, taking tools and guns and pots and so on. Some are love stories, very beautiful love stories, telling how a man pined for his lover who was still in slavery until his mother's brother went and freed her, bringing her back to become the mother of the Kasitu people who live in Bendekonde today. Once, when I was speaking with the elderly Awana Kabiteni, Gome, in 1978, I think Ugo calls him Avo, his grandfather. He was very elderly at that time. I mentioned to him a document that I had found in the Algemeen Rijksarchief here in Den Haag. It was a deliberation of the court in Paramaribo regarding a request made by Kapiteni Alabi in 1779. Alabi had asked the Dutch in Paramaribo whether they could free a sister of his who the whites had captured many years before he was born, and she was still a slave on a plantation. And he said, look, I'm Kapiteni now, could you please free my sister so she can come live out her life with us? The court had deliberations, and they decided that, according to this document, that she was old and useless and no good as a slave anymore, so they could give her back as a special gesture to Kapiten Alabi. And so I told Kapiteni Gome about this story because I had the document, a copy of it. And when I mentioned the woman's name, Tutuba, he started to cry. And he sang a song. He said, it says, Tutuba, Tutuba o mi, ma mio, o mitia goniba, which means Tutuba, my Tutuba, little mama, child, will we ever meet again on this earth? And he said, this is what Alabi's mother used to sing as she pined for her daughter during all those years. Alabi learned his sister's name from his mother because he never knew her. Tutuba, Alabi's sister, the child that the whites caught and carried off. And then Gomez said, my mother's brother once told me the story of Tutuba. You must not forget it as long as you breathe. The sister of Alabi, they captured her in battle. They took her to the city and they put her in slavery. Well, her name was Tutuba. They say she wasn't red, ampibe, baka pure, absolutely black. She died here. She died here on the upper river. They gave her back. She died before Alabi. So that sort of story is a further testimony to the intense family feelings among 18th century Saamakas and the terrible pain brought by forced separation, even after 1762, when they won their freedom. The stories told by Saamaka historians about the period they call Fesiten, first time, the formative years of their society, involve deep secrets about war and healing obias. They involve stories of love, of friendship, and of betrayal. The relationship of today's clans among the Saamakas is built on the relationships that were carried out in first time. They strongly influence, for example, the difficulties Saamakas are having today in designating a gama. Ever since Gama Ochuchu, Belifon, Aboikani died, as you may know, there are now 3 Saamaka Gama, and no one can decide who's the real Gama. But all of that has to do with the stories that took place in the 18th century. And I encourage all of you to read Saamaka history as Saamakas themselves recounted it to me in First Time or Alabi's World, or in Fesite. Thank you very much.
Theo Richard, tampo even kan want toe vraag ook die ons hebben actie. Dankjewel, Richard, heb ik in het Saramakaans gezegd. Of hij even wil blijven staan, misschien is er nog 1 brandende vraag naar hem toe. Ik wil toch nog iets meegeven die van belang is voor zijn werk. Naast dat hij natuurlijk samen met Sally heel veel boeken hebben geschreven over de Saamaka. Hebben ze zich ook altijd ingezet voor de erkenning van de historische rechten van de Marrons. En zijn ze een grote steun geweest bij de rechtszaken die daardoor zijn gevoerd voor het Inter-Amerikaanse Hof voor de Mensenrechten. Misschien zal Hugo Jabini daar ook in zijn inleiding naar refereren. Dat wil ik in ieder geval ook nog meegeven van datgene wat deze 2 mensen hebben gedaan voor de Saamaka. En nu naar vragen toe. Wie heeft een brandende vraag naar Richard? Dan is het heel duidelijk. Oh, heel boven. Oh, ik zie daar helemaal, sorry. Basja Gwinti? Oh. Ja. Pas op. Misschien kan je beginnen met je naam en dan de vraag, alsjeblieft. Gaat uw gang.
Okay. Hi, my name is Anoka Aniseti. I am from Boti Afkomst, and so this anyway. So my question is, why do the Samarkand speak Jews? The language Jews?
You're saying, why does Saamaka come from Jutongo?
No, you say in your story that the Saramaccan people, they speak Jews, right?
No. What I said is this. What I meant to say is that on the Suriname River in the 1690s, when many of the Saamaka people, 1690s, early 1700s, about 90% of the plantations were owned by Sephardic Jews, Portuguese-speaking Jews. They were the masters. And therefore, when Saamakas talked to their masters, the masters talked to their slaves, they would say, for example, Mao, Portuguese. They would say, Omi, Muye. But the Juka masters were English-speaking, and so they would say Man, Uma. They would say Hanu. So there's much more English in Juka language, and much more Portuguese in Saamaka language. And so I was simply talking about how the language spoken by the enslaved Africans along the Suriname River, linguists tend to call it Jutongo, while they call the language spoken on the other plantations at that time Sranantongo. Okay, is that clear?
Yeah, it's loud and clear. Yeah. So I still have another question, because you say all work from Africa. You say, because I did my research, and for what I know, all black skin come from Negro land. So can you explain about that? Because we're keeping saying that we're from Africa, and even all the generation from now believe that. So can you explain why is that?
Misschien, ik zit te kijken of de vraag is voor Richard of voor...
It is actually for you both. I just want to answer because this generation...
Alex, wil je ook even komen?
We know the origins.
Yeah.
We know where the ships came from that came to Suriname and everywhere else in the Americas. We know the names of about 80% of the ships now, and we know a lot about who was on them, so that we can say, for example, that between 1690 and 1700, at the time when the ancestors of the Saamakas were coming, that about 43% or 45%, I forget what Alex's chart showed, came through the port of Loango, which is, and we know from African historians who have studied it, that the enslaved people who were being shipped to the New World through the port of Loango at that time came from the whole Congo River basis, the Zaire River today. And so we know what languages they spoke, who they were, and so on and so forth. We know a great deal about who the enslaved people on Suriname plantations were at a particular time.
Yeah.
They came from many different places in Africa. And we can say, there were about 40% from this place, and 30% from that place, and 10% from another place.
But the thing, you're not sure about what you're saying. You can exactly say where we are from. Another question. How many tribes are there in...
Even wachten, want je stelt een heleboel vragen.
I'm trying to know the truth.
Ja, ik begrijp dat er heel veel vragen zijn.
Because now he doesn't know what he's trying to explain me, and it doesn't get through, So I will.
Nou,
you see that people want to know. I just want to know where I am from.
Mag ik even?
Ja.
Ik denk dat we straks, want de vragen verder kunnen opschrijven.
Later, I will ask him my question. So.
We komen daarop terug. Nu gaat even kijken of Alex daar een toevoeging heeft voor de vraag die je daarvoor hebt gesteld. En dan gaan we een gelegenheid geven aan iemand anders om een vraag te stellen. Daarmee wil niet gezegd dat de vragen waar je die je bezighoudt, dat die niet gesteld kunnen worden. Zoals ik al eerder zei, in het foyer hangen een aantal flappen. Stel daar je vraag en we komen wellicht daarop terug. Oké? Heb je iets aan? Ik denk dat, of u heeft me verkeerd begrepen. Ik kijk ook naar de tijd waarmee we zitten. Daar heeft het mee te maken. Heeft niks met... daar gaat het om. Want we hebben natuurlijk nog heel veel inleiders te gaan. Alex, iets aan toe te voegen?
Ja, één klein ding. Nou, twee kleine dingen. Richard en ik zullen hier tot minstens 8 uur, 9 uur vanavond zijn. Dus klamp ons aan. En we kunnen ook in een clubje gaan zitten met een broodje erbij of whatever. Dus we gaan alle tijd nemen. Als ik de vraag goed begrepen heb, is soms wordt de term Negroland of Negerland of iets dergelijks gebruikt. Toch? Negro. Ja, nou, die term wordt soms gebruikt door mensen die al helemaal niet betrokken waren bij de kolonie of iets dergelijks. Gewoon een andere term voor Afrika. In die tijd, in de 18e eeuw. Wat het grappige, zal ik maar zeggen, of het cynische van waarom weten we nu eigenlijk zoveel over waar Afrikanen vandaan kwamen, is omdat het slavernij was, is omdat het om geld ging en dat het dus in een boekhouding terecht kwam. Daarom bestaat die slave trade database. Ken je die, de slave trade database? Transatlantic Slave Trade Database op internet. Daar staan vrijwel alle schepen die beschreven zijn in de archieven, die gevaren zijn van Europa naar Afrika, naar de Amerika's. Je kunt het dus per land en per regio uitzoeken waar mensen vandaan kwamen. En daar wordt helemaal nooit over Negroland of Negroland of zo gesproken, maar worden veel specifiekere gebieden aangewezen. Dus Negroland is echt een term gebruikt door mensen die al helemaal van toeten nog blazen wisten.
We gaan het toch afronden. Dankjewel. Dankjewel Richard. Dankjewel Alex.